Hello, everyone. I'm Kim Mack. Welcome to the 11th event in the 2025-2026 iteration of the Popular Music Books in Process series, a collaboration between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the Pop Conference. Thank you to my co-organizers, Eric Weisbard, Francesca Royster, Gus Stadler, Carl Wilson, Elena Razlogova, and Alex Vizi. On February 18th, Brandon Tensley and Amani Roberts will be here to discuss their respective books, Whitney Houston's I'm Your Baby Tonight and The Quiet Storm, a historical and cultural analysis of the power, passion, and pain of R&B groups. They'll be in conversation with Emily Lordy. You can find the full schedule on the ASPM US website under the Journal tab, and previous recorded sessions of the Popular Music Books in Process series are archived on Eric's YouTube channel. Today, we're very excited to have Jonathan Bernstein and Robert Morast here to discuss their respective book projects. What Do You Do When You're Lonesome? The authorized biography of Justin Townes Earle, published last month by Da Capo Press, and an in-progress novel titled Cowpunk. Jonathan Bernstein is a senior research editor and writer at Rolling Stone and the author of What Do You Do When You're Lonesome? The authorized biography of Justin Townes Earle. He's written for Oxford American, The Guardian, GQ, and The Village Voice, and he lives in Brooklyn. A North Dakota native raised on a ranch by true cowboys, Robert Morast is the transformation editor at the San Francisco Chronicle, where he's worked since the start of 2019. He previously had stints at the Houston Chronicle, Arizona State University, the Virginian Pilot, the Forum, the Argus Leader, and the Pro Rodeo Sports News. Though he's a career journalist focused on the coverage and analysis of popular culture, he's also a writer who's co-authored the horror film The Girl in the Photographs, which was produced by genre master Wes Craven and was an official selection of the Toronto International Film Festival. When he's not writing, Morast enjoys reading about clairvoyance, studying the dissonant beauty of Godhead silo recordings, and wondering why he doesn't live on a beach. After the discussion, there'll be a Q&A, which Gus will moderate. Please put your questions and comments in the chat as they come to you, and Gus will find them there at the end of the discussion. And also feel free to post comments throughout their conversation. So now I will turn things over to Jonathan and Robert.
Great. Robert, you want to go first?
Yeah, go for it. So thank you all for coming. This is a new experience for me, but I'm also excited to do this. Little bit about the book in progress for me. It's a novel called now Cowpunk, and it follows the tale of I always use the word shitty. If swearing offends anybody, please let me know. But it follows the tale of a shitty punk band who is trapped in Texas. Their van breaks down, and they have no money. They don't know what to do. Um, Unbeknownst to his bandmates, the singer has a history in ranching and rodeo, and he enters a rodeo to make money so they can pay for their van repairs. And it soon becomes this parallel tale of a band trying to tour the basements and VFW halls of a state that doesn't always like punk rock, and a singer who is trying to reclaim his past, that he tried to distance himself from inside of a rodeo arena. For me, the reason we're doing this was I like creative writing, but I grew up on a ranch. I grew up around cowboys. I was also in shitty punk bands when I was in college, and I always found these parallel worlds to be very similar in ways that often surprise people. I think that there's a lot of tribalism that's similar, and a lot of like connection to American faith and freedom, in various ways. Also strict adherence to ideals. And I wanted to explore it in a fictional take because I think sometimes you can kind of examine truths closer to the bone in fiction than you can in journalistic writing. Of course, I think people that's up for debate from people, but in my experience, it tends to work that way. Why it's here, not just because of the connection to punk rock, but it's like I also want to try to use the idea of music culture as a way to kind of explain the people and the places in the book. I think that music culture is often a way of like contemporary archaeology for us to understand where people live, where they come from, and who they are. And I'm going to stop rambling now because sometimes I feel like I talk too much. Jonathan, what about your project? Why don't you let us know?
Yeah, I'll just briefly explain what my project is, and then really excited to talk with Robert about our projects. As Robert and I started to speak a little bit about each other's work, we noticed a lot of really kind of interesting and exciting connections. But yeah, first off, thank you everybody for giving your time and listening to Robert and I talk today. I really appreciate it. I'm here to talk about a book that I just published. It's my first book. Came out a few weeks ago, and it is called, it's a biography of the singer Justin Townes Earle. I'll just really briefly explain who Justin was and not assume that everyone here knows who Justin is. But Justin was a singer-songwriter. He was born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee. You may know him as the son of Steve Earle, and the middle namesake of Townes Van Zandt. These names, and Robert and I are going to talk a little bit about kind of like inheritance and family and sort of how people relate to, their family profession. Justin's family profession was, troubadour, singer-songwriter, and he inherited a lot with that name, of course. His father wanted to name him Guy Townes Earle after Guy Clark, and thank God he didn't because he had enough pressure weighing down on him with the name that he did have. But Justin, he had a pretty difficult childhood. His father was absent. His father had substance use issues. His mother had a hard time raising him. Justin soon himself, from a pretty young age, kind of started running wild, developed his own substance use issues at a really young age. Lived a very crazy, chaotic, complex, beautiful, kind of extraordinary life. And one that was cut pretty short. Justin died in 2020, kind of at the height of the pandemic, of a fentanyl overdose after having really a sort of several years sort of tailspin and relapse. Justin had some serious periods of like complete sobriety during his adulthood, and it was during those periods that he wrote a lot, not all, but a lot of his greatest records. But yeah, he released 8 or 9 albums during his career. His kind of peak sort of cultural moment was in the early 2010s with his record Harlem River Blues, which was kind of this like synthesis of gospel and blues and sort of country gospel and this sort of like Southern roots synthesis record that sort of hit right at that moment when, that sort of strange moment in the post-recession years when Mumford and Sons and the Avett Brothers and, banjos were hitting the top 40 radio. Justin sort of benefited from that in a lot of ways, and or sort of coincided with that moment in culture, and distanced himself from it in certain ways, but also embraced and benefited from it in others. And yeah, I spent the I was an enormous fan of Justin's. I found myself very affected by his death in a way that kind of surprised me. And I think part of that reason was because he had introduced me to so much of the roots music kind of coming out of Nashville and of his generation sort of in the past 10, 20 years that I ended up really covering quite a bit of over my career as a music journalist over the past 12 or so years. So when he died, I realized that not only did I think Justin as an artist and as a profound songwriter really deserved to have a book written about him, but I thought that his life and his career was also an opportunity to tell some larger stories of Nashville over the past 30 years and roots music and how it has kind of ballooned and exploded and all these things in recent memory. So yeah, I spent a few years interviewing. My book is largely based on interviews that I conducted with people who knew Justin and research. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk to Robert about how our product projects kind of overlap, and I think there are a lot of really interesting similarities. So I guess I'll just sort of,
Yeah,
yeah. Sorry, go
yeah, I was
ahead,
gonna say,
Robert.
as Jonathan and I talked, it was really easy for my mind to wander to like, that Hank Jr. song family tradition because it seems like there's a lot of that in, the Justin story, but also in the main character in my book. And I do think that focusing on this idea of just kind of the burdens of cultural legacy, family legacy, creative legacy seemed to be an interesting thing to talk about. And if, at the risk of sounding like a shill or something, his book's really good. So if you're curious at all, please pick up Jonathan's book. It's a great read. Um, but yeah, I think Jonathan, if you're cool with it, I'm just gonna start jump into questions about it.
Yeah, let's
Great.
let's ping pong. That sounds good.
Awesome. So Jonathan's book starts out with this idea, this really nice forward about the concept of the myth. This exaggerated and celebrated idea of an artist's kind of life and pain and their creative manifest. And it becomes an obvious theme, kind of a primer, of course, correct for Justin. But for you, Jonathan, I am curious, like, do you feel like he was able to escape it? Do you feel like he tried to avoid it, or was this something that he embraced as a just a legacy of being?
Yeah, so the myth, as Robert put it, it's a phrase that Justin himself comes up with in his sobriety to define basically the attitude that he grew up in and the attitude and the philosophy that he prescribed to as a teenager and as an early 20 something, this idea that, you know, you kind of have to destroy yourself or experience some sort of profound suffering or self-sacrifice in order to create meaningful art. And Justin grew up really believing that it was kind of the air that he breathed in as that, as the son of Steve Earle as this person who grew up in this country music town, myth making town. Um, and it was I the reason I started my book with that concept is because learned more about Justin, I really kind of viewed that as one of his relationship to the myth as kind of one of the great inner conflicts of his life. And a part of him really believed in it deeply, even as he grew older and told people he didn't believe in it and told people it was a myth. Another part of him really believed deeply that it was bullshit. You know, he called it bad information as well. And it was really important to him to distance himself, I think, in a lot of ways. Part of his maturing as a human and as a man and as an artist was to sort of distance himself from this kind of ideology that really harmed him and frankly had almost killed him at a very young age. But you know, where what Justin felt about the myth, I think, often corresponded quite closely to how he was doing in his sobriety or his, you know, substance use.
Mhm.
But the fact remains that he remained very conflicted about what it meant, how he related to it, and something that is kind of I had a hard time almost sort of sitting with as his biographer and making sense of was that, you know, although Justin's greatest first few albums were all made while he was completely sober, two of the records that he was most well known for and that people consider his greatest work, which are Harlem River Blues and his final album, The Saint of Lost Causes, were both written and recorded kind of in the midst of like a pretty profoundly intense relapse. So all of that led to this great conflict, inner conflict that remained in Justin's life kind of until the end, which is, yeah, really kind of brutal in some ways to try to wrestle with. But
So along those lines, sorry to interrupt, but
no, you're
you know,
good.
he also talked about that idea of kind of believing an artist has to destroy himself or part of himself to be successful. So I mean, do you think was he using drugs as a way to achieve that goal? Like, was that also part of the myth that he bought into?
I think definitely, especially when he was growing up, I think that he viewed himself as the son of Steve Earle and as the sort of spiritual son of Townes Van Zandt. He Justin, by the time he's a teenager, thinks that he feels this great sort of weight and responsibility to not only be a musician but to be a very serious, sort of profound American folk singer-songwriter musician in the vein of these two people. And whether explicitly stated or not, you know, his those were his examples, as were his other musical heroes from Billie Holiday to Graham Parsons to Charlie Poole to The Replacements, all folks who kind of that he idolized, who all like, you know, their antics and their persona as sort of tragically kind of chaotic and struggling were all intertwined in sort of the legends that surrounded all of his favorite artists. So I think Justin very much did view the places that his mental health and that his substance use took him to as part of the creative process. I think he came to view that as, like I said, as kind of nonsense later in his life. But in the last year of his life, he was also telling folks that he had to sort of hit rock bottom to reach his most honest place. So again, that was very much part of the kind of inner conflict for him.
So, I mean,
Definitely.
continuing that, was it like attracted to like, or was it self-fulfilling prophecy?
I think it was both. I think you know, Justin related so closely to he tried so hard to separate himself from his father and to establish his own artistic identity separate from, you know, his forebears. I think that was kind of one of the great existential struggles of his life was establishing his own self, irrespective of his dad. But he also idolized them. He idolized his father's songwriting. He idolized his father as father, as much as he also like grieved his father's presence in his childhood. And so, you know, it was Justin and his dad were so alike in so many ways. And I think that a lot of their relationship was sort of kind of repelling each other because, you know, two like sides really repelling. And I think that that really, um, it haunted him in a lot of ways.
So if he would have been like a cobbler, a football player, I don't know, like would he have found himself self-successful? You know,
Yeah.
would he have felt like a failure in the eyes of his family?
It's a good question. The other person in thinking about, you know, vocation and family, the family business. The other person that I think doesn't get talked about enough is Justin's mom, who was a worked as a rigger and sort of like a roadie around Nashville. She set up shows and lighting at shows at the Starwood Amphitheater in Nashville, which is no longer there. And so from both sides of his family, he is kind of seeing music making and the country music business and just the music business as kind of the family trade, both in a kind of higher calling father, troubadour, singer-songwriter sense, and also just and his mom literally working gigs, as just her hourly wage job. And the way Justin talked about it was, if I wasn't doing this, I would be like either in jail or worse, or I'd be working at McDonald's. That was the very sort of self-defeating way that he talked about how I think like some musicians talk about what they do as the only thing they know how to do, right? The only job they've ever had. Um, but he, like many things, he struggled with that too, and there was a large part of him that wanted to, especially later in his career, figure out ways to at least sort of slightly pivot and just maybe become a writer or a novelist or a, base. At one point, he wanted to become a baseball writer. He wanted to find different ways to try to do things that were, yeah, not just being this troubadour singer songwriter person. But I think to answer your question more succinctly, it felt like a trap that he had no real kind of no choice but to walk through, and I don't think he could ever really envision anything else.
Yeah, and related to that, I also wondered, was the myth or the trap of Nashville also part of that? Because obviously you know better than I, but he always struck me as such an outsider. And I do wonder if some of his decisions in his career were also trying to be this, kind of contrived outsider to get away from this Nashville stereotype, this Nashville path that so many people around him took.
Yeah, Justin, he grew up in Nashville. He was very proud of being Nashville raised, and yet he kind of despised, I think because it was so familiar to him, there was also a part of him that really sort of despised the conventions of his hometown. That there was a part of him that despised what the music business in Nashville did to the children, walking around wondering where their parents are in elementary school, like wondering when their dad might come home from tour. There was a part of him that he has a line where he says, um, no women want to date musicians in Nashville because it reminds them of their dads. Like he had all these deep sort of complex psychological sort of traumas related to sort of what it meant to grow up so close and in as part of the music business in Nashville. And so, when he signs a record deal, he quite intentionally goes outside of the city and signs with Bloodshot Records in Chicago, which is kind of this like roots leaning, but also very kind of DIY indie punk ethos label. Um, and he's very proud of, signing, as he put it during his Grand Ole Opry debut. We had to go outside of Nashville to make an old-fashioned country record. But it was, it's kind of always two sides of one thing. It was also it was Justin's dream to play the Grand Ole Opry. And when he achieved it, he was about as proud and as excited as he ever was in his whole career. And then about a year later, he's sort of trashing the whole world of the Opry and old-fashioned country music, and says that he wants nothing to do with it. So he had a very complex and sort of tortured relationship to his hometown, and he tried to leave it many times. Uh, Usually found himself pretty homesick for Nashville, like literally the city, and wound up, dying in an apartment about a mile from where he was born. So it's a very kind of he tried very hard to escape it, but also sort of couldn't help himself but continue to return, both literally and geographically, and also sort of like more conventionally. When Justin moves to New York very loudly, right before he makes the record Harlem River Blues. And Harlem River Blues is an album that is kind of in large part like lyrically about New York City. It's about this new sort of homeland of his that he's discovering. There's songs about, the Harlem River and the six train and like Brooklyn. But he goes back home to Nashville to make the record. So it's a very kind of, yeah, he had a very sort of love-hate, I would say, relationship with his hometown and what it represented.
Yeah, I also find it interesting that, and much of his work, you can hear this Texas swing influence, which seems so. different than Nashville, at least some of the traditional Nashville sounds, not just the people that moved there, but the people kind of grew up from it. And I always wondered if that was also part of the his reaction to kind of just veer away from what he knew.
Definitely. I mean, my book opens, the first scene in my book is Justin's father, who was not technically born, Steve Earle was not technically born in Texas, but he was born on an army base and very soon after relocated as a young child to Texas and considers himself a Texan, is a Texan. But my book opens with a scene of Steve doing to Justin what Steve's father had done to him, which what many people in the, Texas diaspora do when they're born, if they're not born in Texas, which is placing Justin feet into a bowl of Texas soil, sort of anointing him as a spiritual Texan. And Justin is buried in Texas. Justin, a big part of him, I think, was from that place, even though he never lived in Texas. And yeah, certainly musically with Western swing, but also probably even more to the point, a lot of the sort of Texas blues, country blues traditions are pretty much at the core of Justin's actual artistic self and soul. And so, yeah, Texas is an enormous part of who he was as a person and an artist, for sure.
Yeah, it almost feels like it fits into that myth idea as well. I mean, especially coming from his father.
Justin and his dad both loved tall tales. They were Texas tellers of tall tales. They both prescribed to the idea that you should never let truth get in the way of a good story. And that was both a really fun opportunity for me as a journalist and as a biographer, and also as a fact checker, which is kind of like my day job at Rolling Stone, was to sort of try to sort through the myth and the fiction and kind of let tell the truth about what actually happened to this person, but also kind of let Justin's much more interesting version of the story have oxygen in writing the book. But yeah, they were both alike in so many ways, and certainly with that sort of that Texas grandeur for storytelling is maybe the biggest thing that they shared.
Yeah, as a former Texan, I can tell you, it's just there's a very fascinating elixir of just being there and buying into all that BS. It feels so good. Yeah. So, um, as you know in your book, Justin had a punk phase and a hip hop phase, which is fun. But how do you think exploring those kind of, I think notably rebellious genres also informed who he became later as a musician and as a person?
Yeah, as it was really fun for me to learn what some of Justin's actual early childhood music influences were. The story that Justin told about himself was that, basically one day he just discovered Kurt Cobain singing Lead Belly on MTV Unplugged, singing in the Pines, and sort of bonding with his dad over that, and that leading him down this sort of grand, very serious um, sort of education in American folk music, which did happen, but that happened when Justin was about 14 or 15. And before that, he listened to a lot of stuff that he didn't really ever talk about having listened to. He loved Beck. He loved the, West Coast punk band Operation Ivy. He loved the Chicago rapper Twista. He also just loved, grunge and Pearl Jam and like, early 90s kids, early 90s music. He loved Snoop Dogg. He loved Ice Cube. And yeah, I think Justin kind of shedded he had all sorts of, as many of us do in our pre-adolescence and adolescence, like many just sort of like micro phases of goth kid and grunge punk and, um, sort of white hip hop Southern kid. Uh, and I think was really kind of introduced to musical subculture and community and in all sorts of, and yeah, did these ideas of rebelliousness when he was a very angry, pissed off, and alone 12-year-old. I think a lot of that was he was actually consuming all of those feelings and processing all of those feelings, both as a listener and also kind of as a amateur 12-year-old musician through much more through like grunge, punk, and hip hop than through, singing like um Lead Belly songs as a little kid. So those things really, while they kind of were never obvious, kind of on the surface influences in his music, I think on a deeper sort of identity level and sort of emotional level for him, they're about as central to his listening identity and musical identity that shaped him as anything else. Totally.
Totally.
Um,
Jinx. Um, yeah. So he's got this line on one of his songs. I can't remember the name of the song, but it's like he says, "Well, I think I can be lonesome on my own," which I always loved. And while reading your book, that came to mind, and it just kind of it felt like that line carried a different weight for me. And
Mm.
I'm always fascinated by the idea of people who are outsiders, even in a room full of their friends and peers, right? And I got that sense from him. Um, how much do you think that aspect of kind of otherness contributed to his art?
I think that's a very astute question. I think it contributed quite a bit to his art. I think Justin viewed himself as either on performing in front for an audience, whether it was on a stage or at a party or in a group of people. He told people that the minute you walk up, the minute you show up to a venue, you're performing. The performance starts, the show starts then. He was either doing that and being Justin Townes Earle to the world, or he was literally or metaphysically by himself. I think in his own thoughts, on his in his lonesome, in his own room. He was a very solitary, quiet, and in a lot of ways introverted person who, yeah, spent a large portion of his life kind of in his bedroom or in his study, just sort of singing to himself and writing music and he I think sort of a kind of existential kind of aloneness set in at a very, very, very young age for Justin. I'm talking like, elementary school or pre-elementary school, based on kind of what his childhood was like. And I think that that aloneness was something of a comfort, a very complicated comfort for him. I think he tended to actually become, he didn't know what to do with true intimacy and closeness, whether that be romantic or professional or personal. He would grow very close to people and then find ways to really push them away if they got too close. So I think you're spot on. I think that's one of the sort of core themes of his songwriting. And from that song, which is on his first record, I think it's "Far Away in Another Town" that you're quoting,
Yeah.
to the very last song he ever on his last record, which is a song called "Talking to Myself," which is about the loneliest song I've ever heard. So yeah, it's a great question. Um, should we maybe want? I'm gonna switch
Let
gears
me
and start interviewing you. You want to do one
Yeah,
more?
let me
Okay.
do one more wrap up.
Okay.
I think,
Okay.
and this is probably a habit from like my journalistic days, which are still on. Um, but whenever you take these undertakings of exploring someone that you admire or are curious about, I'm always curious like what you found out about this person or yourself through the research that surprised you. That kind of recast your understanding of who this person was.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think one of the sort of main things that I found out about Justin, and I don't know if this is just the nature of writing about another human, because this is my first book and my first biography of my first undertaking of trying to professionally understand another human to this degree. But one of the things that I really found out, at least in Justin's case, is that, as I was saying before, he had his own sort of way of telling his own story and narrating his own life and telling his own emotional truth. And then I had my own way of going about it, finding the much less interesting, more nuanced, unglamorous actual truth of, what actually happened, where was he actually living, what actually happened when he's making these allusions to these things. And one thing that I learned is that like the space in between those two things, Justin's story and like the cold hard facts, I think often is where a lot of the meaning that I found in his life to exist,
Mm.
the ways in which he told lies, the ways in which he told half truths, and the ways in which he kind of emotionally narrated his own life in sort of like unreliable and fanciful, but also very sort of protective and self-protective ways, finding that space between that and the actual truth, finding out that when he talked about having been he talked about how had been incarcerated as a 14-year-old for 6 months. And when I was always suspicious of that claim, and it wasn't backed up in prison records or anything like that. But eventually I came to realize that he was talking about having been sent away to like a troubled teen wilderness camp by his father involuntarily. And so like there were hundreds of examples of things like that, but learning kind of, oh, the fact that Justin talked about this experience in his life as sort of one of incarceration I think, tells me so much emotionally about how he experienced and processed and then later remembered and narrated that period in his life. So I don't know that I expected that. To find so much of the like true, deeper, I think, emotional and psychological meaning of my subject in the sort of that space between the facts and the myth, in a way. I don't know if that makes sense or is
Oh,
satisfying, but
totally. Yeah, makes great
um,
sense. And again, wonderful book. Great job,
Thank
man.
you, Robert. I really appreciate it. I'm so excited to ask you some questions about Cowpunk, which I've had a chance to read a portion of and is really interesting and exciting. And I would love to start with just asking you to expand on something that you already sort of briefly mentioned in your introduction to the book. But we're both journalists. Your job as a journalist is to go out there and report the truth. And you've already mentioned that you feel like there can be ways in which exploring sort of certain types of truths through fiction can be a more sort of fertile ground to kind of get at certain types of truths than writing in nonfiction or writing journalism. And I'm curious to hear more about what you mean by that and how this project has kind of brought that out for you. What truths you've been able to get at through fiction.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome question. So, one of my first jobs was working at a small paper in South Dakota, which is actually the biggest paper in South Dakota, but small relatively to, where I work now, say. Um, and because I wanted to be a music and culture writer, I would spend a lot of time hanging out with punk kids in the small town and going to their basement shows and talking to them at their jobs at fast food restaurants and talking to them in their vans when they're going on tour and stuff. And, I'd write stories about that, but it never really seemed to actually like tell the whole story of their life or who they were. It's like the things I found most interesting and telling about their situations, their creativity were often things that they would never talk about, but that were just observations. And observations I didn't always want to write about because they seemed very personal and not
Mm,
always flattering. Where you see the lonely moments they might have backstage at a concert. You see the depressing drug moments they might have in a bathroom in their basement, things like that. And again, it's like it always bothered me. I could never really get to tell that in an honest way in my reporting of it. Also, my
mm,
editors wouldn't really, they didn't really want me to at the time. Um,
hmm
so fast forward like several years later, 2020 happened, the pandemic happened, which I'm sure we all remember too well. But at the Chronicle here, I pitched and led this project that we called the Through Line, and we envisioned what San Francisco and the Bay Area might look like 5 years later because it was such a paradigm shift of how we lived. So we wanted to give people kind of an understanding of what might be on the other side. Um, and we did these weekly installments of this Through Line series. But one thing that we were adamant about was including like a short fiction piece in every issue from like a Bay Area fiction author. And what we found is that some of the most like bizarre or forward-reaching ideas were more palatable in the fiction than they were in the deeply reported, nuanced journalistic stories, right? So that stuck with me and just kind of like this idea of I think accepted truth is sometimes easier coming from fiction than it is documentary journalism, the
mm,
like. And it just seemed like a thing to explore in a novel form, which I always wanted to do as well.
mm. Cool. This is just sort of, kind of stepping back to almost the beginning. Like, what were some of, in terms of this book, Cowpunk and sort of its genesis, what were some of the kind of, for you, inner questions, burning questions, or sort of themes that you felt like kickstarted your impulse to want to tell this story? Was it the character himself, the protagonist of Lamore? I don't know. I hope I'm saying that right. What did you feel like was the initial sort of spark plug for wanting to tell this story?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, like when I was in college, I was in shitty punk bands and we played in weird places, including an honest to God crack house one time, and I loved it, man. It was so fun. I mean, look at me. I look like I'm cosplaying as Ian McKay. But like when it's time I graduated, it's time to get a job. The job that paid the most was at the Pro Rodeo Sports News. I have a history in rodeo. My family are rodeo participants and cowboys. So it made a lot of sense to do that because I wanted more money, but it also I was like, hey, I can study this like American subculture, which I always find fascinating. So every week they would fly me to a different rodeo around the U.S. And it might be in Arkansas, it might be in California, it might be in New Jersey. So you're all over, and you see these commonalities in each rodeo scene and among the cowboys who are performing at the rodeos. And it was so hard not to see like this mirror of what I saw in the punk scenes around the
Mm,
Midwest and the Plain States. It was a different uniform, it was a different lingo, but they were the same people. They were
mm,
all looking for like this makeshift family. They were all looking for like an ideal to worship in many ways. And they were all like these, parts of this subculture that just seemed so quintessentially American, but also like American in the sense that it's so about the idea of freedom, even if it's contrived freedom or distorted freedom. But it seemed like these similes were too hard to ignore. So I was like,
Hmm.
the idea had been burning in me for a long time, and I think I finally, with age, was able to understand it more and let it coalesce a little toward an understanding. For the main character, I just, when you're writing fiction, whether it's like for film or novel, it's like it obviously I think it helps to have a character that has conflict, that feels pulled in multiple directions. So it just made sense to have this person who is stuck between these two worlds. Someone who does feel like an outsider, even among their peers, their friends, someone who doesn't really feel at home anywhere, but wants to. So is always trying to like wrestle with who they are through identity, but also through the world around them. If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
It does. And when Robert and I first were talking about our projects, that kind of connection between sort of country culture, country subculture, ranching, country music, and sort of punk subculture, punk music as a genre, that was one of the first sort of commonalities that struck us. I mean, the thing that introduced me to not only Justin Townsend but the Replacements was his countrified mandolin-driven cover of "Can't Hardly Wait" by the Replacements. So I think there's a lot. Yeah, that's really interesting. Jumping on that, or staying on that same topic, can you talk a little bit about sort of like how some of the commonalities in those two genres and how both genres sort of relate to ideas of purity and authenticity and sort of regulating and sort of maybe even gatekeeping its own sort of
Yeah.
borders and its own communities?
Yeah, totally. I mean, like the essence of purity is so strong and pronounced in each of them. Obviously in punk, it's like you have to be a punk. You have to like worship the idea of anarchy, even if anarchy is impossible. You know, it's like it's judged by what you wear and what you say as much as anything else. And then back to like when I was in South Dakota covering scenes, like there'd be a straight edge scene, and the instant any straight edge punk would smoke a cigarette, have a drink of beer, they were completely ostracized, thrown to the curb, kicked out of the house they live in. It's like they were persona non grata. It's just the idea of upholding this idea of purity is just so strong there. And then on the other side is like, rodeo and cowboy culture, it's very rebellious, like I think in nature, but yet it's also very Christian. It's also very American. It's also very like fit in or we're going to kick your ass. You know, they have strict adherence to lingo. They have strict adherence to fashion. They have strict adherence to timeliness at the rodeo. They have strict adherence to modesty, which I find fascinating. It's almost the inverse of punk. Punk is, at least in that again that contrived sense. It's like be loud, be boisterous, be irreverent. And in the rodeo culture, it's almost like be modest to no fault. One of the things that took me away from that job at the rodeo sports news was it was terrible interviewing these guys because like somebody could have just had the most amazing like rodeo moment in the history of the world, and I'd be like, man, how was it? How do you feel? What happened? And like 99 of 100 times I'd go, well, I got lucky. God smiled on me today. Could have been anybody else. Just like they cannot talk about themselves until you get to the bar at night. And then you see them jumping on tables and pouring beer down their friends' necks and telling everybody they're great and trying to peacock toward women. It's like I saw the same behavior in punk stuff after the concerts as well. I feel
Hmm.
like I'm veering off. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it does. It does. Of course, something that really, having written the book that I wrote about this father and son relationship, that your protagonist's relationship to his father and sort of his father's tradition, where his father comes from, really struck me. There's a scene where Robert's main character is sort of thinking back on listening to the song Amarillo by Morning by George Strait with his dad, and Robert writes, "They never spoke when that song played, but every time it was on, he knew that his dad was grieving," which I just really love that line. I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit again, because this surfaced so much for me and thinking about how Justin related to vocation and trade and sort of the family higher calling versus work and just the family business really, how your character and specifically in the sort of world of ranching and rodeo, how sort of father and son dynamics and just broadly speaking those traditions of sort of like yeah work and the family business sort of played into this story that you're telling, if that
Yeah,
makes
it's
any
it's
sense.
paramount. Yeah, totally. It's paramount. Speaking from very close examples, my brother and my dad, best friends. They're both diehard cowboys. Um, they've been best friends since my brother was probably 7 years old. And it's because of this shared understanding of who they are, what they want to be, and where they come from, right? Um, It's not to say I wasn't also friends with my dad, but it's just different. But my brother's
Mm.
relationship with him is so much different than mine was with my dad. We actually buried my dad a couple weeks ago, and I'm hearing stories from his friends about him. And one thing that kind of surprised me is one of his friends was like, he said, "Yeah, um, Lee, my dad said he'd go to your brother to talk about physical things, goals and that kind of stuff. He'd come to me to talk about emotions." you
Mm.
know so I kind of wanted to use this character to explore both of those sides, like the things that my brother gets more of or got more of from my dad, and the things that I got more of from my dad. That idea of like listening to that song and grieving, some of that is like just the cold realities of aging. It's like you age out of rodeo. You can't, especially if you're like a rough stock competitor, which is like bull riding, saddle bronc, bareback, steer wrestling. It's like there's a physicality and a vigor you need to succeed in that. And at some point, your body just won't allow you to be good, or it breaks down, or you're going to get injured because you're just not strong enough to handle these animals anymore. So with some of these cowboys, what you see over time is like they will look at a rodeo, they will hear a song about rodeo, and they do feel like they are grieving that moment. Because for so many of them, like the highlight of their lives is that 8 seconds or 10 seconds in the arena. Every time they do it, that's what they live for. There's this saying in rodeo world is like every time you're not in the arena, you're dying. It's like you just live for
Mm.
those seconds inside because that's when you feel the most alive. So it's like there's this constant, I think, aspect of grief in the aging rodeo world. Unless you're a team roper, those guys can do it till they're like 70. Um, but that's kind of what I was getting at. Again, hope that made sense.
Oh, it does. That's really profoundly put. And yeah, I'm so sorry about your father. It makes
Oh, no worries.
hearing you talk about that makes me re find another commonality in our projects and our books, which is that we're both writing about, in my case, real father and son relationship, in your case, a fictional father and son relationship, and we're also very much in some ways working through our own father-son relationships and writing about
Yeah.
those things. Of course, my father and I share a tight bond over music, like Justin and Steve did. Um, but kind of on a slightly lighter and maybe even more fun note, one thing that seems so fun to me, just as part of the project that you get to do, is sort of creating the fictional world of the punk band that your protagonist is in, Chemical Burn, which is an excellent fictional punk band name.
Thank you.
What is it, or what was it like coming up with a fictional band and sort of the world building that you got to sort of get to sort of play around with, whether it's the interpersonal dynamics of the band or its influences or its tensions. What did you draw a lot on your own personal experience in creating the world of Chemical Burn?
Yeah, definitely. And some of it's just like necessity, right? Obviously when you write screenplays, you need to build this world that you understand, right? So that
Right.
whenever you're asked a question about any aspect, you understand it, right? Excuse me. It's different from journalism, obviously, because I can just go talk to people and be like, "What was it like? How'd you get this idea? Where'd you come up with the idea for this color? So you have to manifest it and create this world. And it's fun, man. I mean, frankly, it's like it was in some ways the best part of the whole process,
Right.
because there's no wrong answers, man. You know what I mean? And it's like it's ego fulfillment in so many ways. Like I played bass in bands, so I was never the focal point of the act, or the creative genius in it. But here it's like I kind of lived through it. It's like I contacted an old musician buddy and we wrote songs for this because I wanted to have a musical base of understanding. I contacted a friend who's a graphic designer and we created logos for the band because I wanted to understand that. Um,
Mm.
it's like I would sit there sometimes at night when I haven't had writer's block, and I would just look at like maps and just be like, okay, which cities should we go to if we're touring in this part of the country? Like just I wanted
That's
to be
amazing.
foolproof, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
fictional tour routing is important.
Oh yeah, awesome. And again, like it all works out there. I don't have to worry about getting enough people at the gate. But but like, it was also totally humbling, man, because it's like I felt like I wanted to understand what it was like to be a vocalist. So when we were making the music for this act, Chemical Burn, it's like I was like, well, I'm gonna sing it. And it's like, everyone's like, I could do that. I can't do that. I'm a shitty singer. I don't have the charisma to hold it. And I felt that was really, really informative to the process as well. Like to think about what you need there to be captive to an audience or to captivate an audience, right? What you need to also like have this unwavering like confidence in yourself and your abilities. And it's just like, if I was a singer in a band, we would suck because I'd just be like, oh, I had a shitty night, people. Sorry. you know.
Yeah.
So I think like getting that sense of humbleness was very, very essential to this project as well.
Do we get to a point of drawing out fictional set lists for the band?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the problem is we don't have a whole lot of songs. So it's like, it's
Yeah.
one of those true to life punk bands where it's like the set is like 16 minutes. You know what I mean? And that was literally the goal when I talked to my friend. I'm like, okay, like we just need enough songs for like a 15, 17-minute set. Can we do that? And we're like, yeah, we got it. I don't know if we wrote 7 songs, 2 are probably listenable, you know,
Amazing.
because of me. The other guy's very talented. I am not.
Well, your book, which is still in progress, and under editing, is what I've read of it already is so exciting, and I can't wait to read the finished product, and I can't wait for the world to read the finished product. It's really compelling,
Thank you.
entertaining, and really kind of an emotional take on all the themes we've been discussing. I think we are sort of reaching time for some questions, if that seems all right with folks. I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah.
Um, yeah, thanks so much. It was really great to listen to you all um, dialogue, and thanks for doing all the work of sort of preparing that. So we have a few questions, and if people still welcome to put more in the chat. The first one is coming from David McPherson. David, do you want to unmute or unmute and come on camera
Oh,
if you want?
sure.
So go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, basically, Jonathan, I know I unfortunately have not read your book yet. I need to get a copy of it, but I'm looking forward to it. As you know, I mean, I love Justin's music, and I've been fortunate to have interviewed his dad many times. And you talked a little bit about that whole myth making, and I'm curious, about access for this book to Steve, and in terms of asking him about his son, because like you said, that was a pretty complicated relationship. I know Steve's been sober for a long time, and even just that idea, if you even ask Steve about, in retrospect, about that extra weight he might have put on Justin by naming him, Justin Towns Earle.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, Steve did not speak with me for this book. I was not surprised by that. I kind of just intuited that going into the project. Steve has never really given an interview about his son since his son's passing. And doesn't like Justin doesn't love talking about people other than himself in general. And I was part of me was dying to speak with Steve and just have him for several days and just pick his brain on any of the hundreds of anecdotes that people who knew both Justin and Steve had told me, and to get him to really, Steve's talked about Justin a million times, but to get him to really kind of bear down about it, I was disappointed that I wasn't able to do that. At the same time, Steve is incredibly, like Justin, an incredibly seductive and sort of commanding storyteller. His narrative tends to sort of overtake any room that he's in. And it would have been a real challenge, frankly, I really wanted this book to be about Justin, and I really wanted Steve to serve as the father in this book and not as the person who's actually kind of quietly overtaking the narrative. So I think in some ways, not having the chance to speak to Steve really enabled me to stay totally true to that mission. But yeah, I would have loved to speak with Steve Earle for this book. Had thousands of questions for him.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have a question that's kind of a follow-up to that, which is just, I think, the genre of biography seems to require on the biographer's part, sort of establishing kind of intimacy with both with the subject and with the people who knew him. And then in this case in particular, involves these issues that are quite difficult.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like how you establish trust with the people that you were talking to. I mean, it was interesting to hear that, and I also wasn't surprised to hear that Steve didn't talk to you, but
Yeah.
some of
Yeah.
some of that stuff's going to be true with everybody you talk to about this.
Yeah, anyone who, there were plenty of people who, especially initially, I think expressed either explicitly or implicitly some skepticism about who I was, why I was doing this. And frankly, anyone expressed that, I viewed that as a really strong indicator that they really cared about Justin. I thought it was, always thought it was totally justified. You know, I never questioned it or resented any skepticism of me. Um, I think, not everybody, but a large percentage, maybe even a majority of the people that interviewed for this book are all kind of connected and know each other and are part of a community of 40 somethings who were born and raised in Nashville and lived there at a certain time. And so I think there was a lot of kind of a process of internal vetting of me that I wasn't even really privy to. And people would tell me, oh, so and so told me you weren't like a total freak or exploitative, weirdo. So I think that really helped sort of build some sort of community and communal trust. And I heard later in the process from a few folks that like yeah, I approached this as a fan. I am a fan. I also approached this as someone who was kind of desperate to get it right factually and the details right. And so what I often felt at the time was me harassing and hassling people by just sending relentless follow-up questions asking to confirm and corroborate dates and times and temperatures. And it's just, I think actually, ultimately looking back, I think helped build trust because people saw that if I was obsessing on where the borders between these two Nashville neighborhoods were in 1994, then maybe I cared about this person enough to tell the right story. So I think that helped.
Cool, thank you. The next question is from Dana Paulin.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Robert especially started to answer my question towards the end of his comments when he was talking about rodeo culture. And I guess my question is, the way I wrote it is, Robert at one point talked about subcultures, and I'm just wondering for both of you how you go from an emphasis on an individual. So it could be an individual fictional character or an individual biographical figure, how you can generalize from what they did, maybe their uniqueness, to any general thoughts about a genre. So, do they represent a genre or do they represent their own particularity within the genre? And, to what extent can we draw any conclusions about a genre, in this case, cowpunk, from individuals and their specificity?
Hmm.
Um, so I guess I'll take a tack that I often do with my writers at the Chronicle, where it's like I feel like in that kind of process, it's like I'm big into the idea of mosaic storytelling, where it's just like one person doesn't represent the scene, right? But they are a piece of the scene, and they may be a very prominent piece of the scene that if you are looking at a mosaic, it may be the most important piece, right? But it's not that just them. It's everything in that piece of art, that collective, that construct, right? Obviously, it's like in fiction writing it's like you use someone as a vessel to kind of like explore a larger issue, right? But I'll go back to that. I'm still big on just a part of it because like if you again it's weird talking about a fictional thing that y'all haven't read, but it's like if you look at the interpersonal play between like band members, it's like they are very different, right? And it's like they would represent different kind of like again mosaic tiles in the larger story, but they also have these similarities that bind them. And I think when you're using an individual to talk about a scene, a culture, it's like you have to talk about that connective tissue between entities, between people, between houses, scenes, music, songs, whatever, right? So that's how I look at it.
And all I'll say, I love the question, Dana. All I'll say for me is that, Justin, like many performers and recording artists, told his story as the sort of individualistic tale, as we're all kind of, pressured to tell our stories as individuals. I almost felt like it was my job, though the on paper, the book is about this one person. I almost felt like the large part of my job was in writing this book was to place him in his time, place, and music scene and genre, and specifically Nashville from 1997 to 2005, like as a product of this community and city. And so I found that very exciting and a lot more true to, reality as
Right.
this person who existed at a time and place and is a product of it.
Yeah, and that's great. I would say that this idea of scene, which both of you used, is really important to thinking about the individual and the general.
For sure.
All right. Mark Engelson, do you want to ask your question? Mark, you're still there?
Yeah, hello,
Yeah.
hello. Yeah, I did mention in the chat, by the way, that uh, getting to talk to Steve can be a mixed blessing because depending on the day you catch him, there's never a mystery as to what Steve Earle is feeling because it's very clear in dealing with him, and you can either get a really positive experience or it can be terrifying, and you never know which one you're going to get. My question was is this being an authorized biography, how did that affect your approach in the final product?
Yeah. One thing that thanks for that question, Mark. Great to see you. I echo your thoughts about what it is like to interview Steve. And like Steve, Justin was also what one of his friends referred to as an out loud processor. So they also shared that. Um, I learned pretty early on that no one knew what authorized biography really meant. I certainly didn't, and I at times realized that people who write biographies disagree on what authorized and unauthorized means. For me, it meant really just one thing, which is that Justin's estate, which is just one person, it is his widow, Jen Marie Earle, approved of this biography, approved of me writing it, and participated as a source quite extensively. So, what that really did for me, frankly, I mean, in addition to having the privilege of getting to speak with his widow, who really was kind of a prime witness to, primary witness to his life and his inner life and his private life, and unfortunately also his demise in the last, in his 30s, basically. In addition to that, there were a lot of people who, like I said before, were their initial response to me requesting to speak with them was like, "Who are you? What is this? Is this legit? Does the family support this?" And there were some people who didn't speak with me because Steve Earle was not speaking with me, and I respected that. But there were many more people who were willing to speak with me because this was officially sanctioned by his estate, because Jen Marie was willing to, put her sort of like nod of approval towards the fact that I was attempting this independent work of journalism. So there were dozens of folks who, when they got an email or a text message or whatever from me, they would immediately pretty much forward it to Jen and ask her if I was legit and ask her if she approved of it. And she was, in that way, she really opened up a lot of access for me, and made this, I hope, a richer, more honest, more comprehensive sort of story of Justin because of its authorization. But the last thing I'll say is that from the first time we talked, it was very clear to me that Jen had the same goal that I did, which is like, let's tell a very honest story about this person, and let's not try to paper over the reality of some of the darker things in his life. And that, for me, I know that not every biographer has that when writing an authorized book. There are a lot of problems that there's an inherent tension there, and it wasn't always a smooth, uncomplicated process, but the fact that we both trusted each other and what we really wanted it to be in terms of its honesty was made it for a really amazing experience for me.
I I can't imagine without her cooperation, you would have gotten some of the information on things like medications he had tried for his issues.
For sure. I mean, there were a lot of things, there were a lot of private elements of Justin's life pertaining to his mental health and pertaining to his substance use and pertaining even to some of his more violent tendencies that I don't think I would have had access to without her bravery and willingness to go to these tough places and trying to tell the fullness of his story.
Right. I actually had a question for Robert. It's really interesting to hear you talk about, the specifics of fiction and what truth means in that mode, et cetera. And I was curious about um like the challenges of writing about music in fiction, um, specifically.
Hmm.
Um, I obviously haven't, I guess none of us have read your book yet, but and I don't know exactly what role like music itself plays in it, or the sound, i.e., like sound. But yeah, I'm wondering how you kind of approached that, or and even if you had there were like other novels that in which music is a um, features centrally that you found useful for thinking about that.
Oh, that's an awesome question. Thank you. So first, I'll answer your last one. Yeah, I can't think of any novels. I mean, other people may have some examples that I don't. I mean, I read too much like classic literature or just like Cormac McCarthy over and over again. So I may be the worst to ask that. But in terms of like how I use it, it's like it just I wanted to be a cultural reference point throughout. It's like if there's a reference to Queens of the Stone Age playing those desert shows in Southern California, things like that, but making sense of the narrative. I will say this though, like in early drafts, even before this one, I had like one of my close friends read it, and his only note was he's like, "You sound like a music critic trying to write a novel." So it's like I had to trim back like this analysis that's just so natural to get into when you mention an artist or a song or a moment or a scene, right? So it's just like it's really like trying to like hold back those instincts and try to be tame about it. Like there was one, for example, like there's one mention of an AC/DC song. Uh, Jailbreak, at some version of the novel. And it's like, the first draft had like 3 pages of me explaining why it's the greatest rock song ever and they're the best rock band ever and blah, blah, blah. And now I think it's like 2 sentences. So it's like it's really paring that stuff back. I think it's more, in some ways when I got more comfortable writing this, it's like I'd listened to a lot of my favorite country songs for obvious reasons. And it got to the point where I wanted to tell everybody that I know about music and really instead try to match the emotion of the music that I love in the writing for this project. I think when I got to that point, it felt more natural. It felt more, worthy, I suppose. Granted, I'm not Cormac McCarthy, but it feels better. I hope that answered it.
None of us are Cormac McCarthy, but yes, that's super interesting. Thank you. Um, Looks like we have another question from Elena.
Hello, thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I was wondering if each of you had a particular book or author that you really used as a model for writing, like an ideal novel by style or structure, or an ideal biography by style or structure that you were kind of trying to reach on the writing level.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll go first, Robert. I mean, I tried to read a lot of biographies when I was in the early stages of writing this book, and I also tried to read almost left of center biographies, like that were sort of doing things with the genre, even though I kind of knew I'd be writing a somewhat traditional one. Out of all of them, I feel like the person that I tried to in some way copy or just emulate or just be inspired by the most was probably R.J. Smith, who I think is a friend of this world. His books about James Brown and more recently Chuck Berry, both of those books blew my mind. The level of just crazy rigor and research, combing through St. Louis census data and the way that he effortlessly and very literarily integrates that stuff, the way that he goes into little diatribes and asides, but always leads you right back onto the path, like right when you're ready to be led back onto the path. I just find him to be a like totally genius biographer, and I don't think that I successfully imitated him in any kind of way, but I tried. I just find his biographies to be like kind of mesmerizing.
As I mentioned earlier, it's like huge Cormac McCarthy fan. I think his writing manages to be sparse and informative at the same time, or I should say sparse and dense at the same time. And it's art. So I mean, aspiring toward that is great. It's like when I was a bassist, I wanted to play like Flea, or John Paul Jones. Never got there, but it's like you got to aim high, right? Another one is J.M. Coetzee, a South African writer. He's also very sparse but informative. The thing I like about his work so much is like I've never been to South Africa, but every time I've read one of his novels, it feels like I have a greater understanding of the cultural strife there. And he doesn't really get deep into it. Some of it's subtext, some of it is illusion, right? But it's just I feel like he creates a world that's very lived in and familiar, even if you're not familiar with it. So I think that was key. I will say, like, because I'm a snob and I can't help myself, like I did not want to write something like Daisy Jones and the Sixth. I just didn't want to do that kind of style. It's like the egoist in me is like, no, 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 I want to write literature, not just like, some fun novel. Probably a really bad decision on my part, but that's what I wanted to do.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a great question.
All right, it looks like we're ready to wrap up. So thanks so much to our presenters. Thanks everybody for coming. And we'll be back in 2 weeks.
Awesome.
And
Truly thank you to everybody, and thank you to Gustavus for and to everyone for for being here. Thank you to Kimberly for introducing us. I really it's an honor to get to speak with you all in this world, in this space.
yeah, it's a huge pleasure.
Likewise. Likewise. I got